I'm Leslie Elliott Boyce, and this is The Radical Center, a recording project I began in 2022 as a way to describe and discuss the social and ideological currents that are rapidly altering our culture. In a time when political polarization seems to be the norm, I'm seeking to understand rather than react. I'm grateful to all the thoughtful men and women who share their stories and insights with me in this conversation series. If you would like to contribute to this project financially, there are links in the description. Thank you, and thank you all for listening and being part of this exploration. Hi, today I'm talking with Dr. Craig Weiner. Dr. Craig Weiner is a licensed clinical psychologist based in Worcester, Massachusetts?
Yeah, Worcester, yeah.
Worcester. Okay, I knew that there was a trick with that pronunciation. Thank you. He obtained his doctoral degree from Clark University in 1979. In addition to over 40 years of private practice, he's been an assistant professor in the Department of Family Medicine and Community Health at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. For over 2 decades, he was the clinical director of mental health services at a community health center, where he supervised a large staff of clinicians and graduate students. Dr. Weiner is the author of 3 books on attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and he has presented his work at national and state conventions for psychologists and social workers. His current book, Backyard Politics, A Psychological Understanding of Today's Political and Social Divide, is a culmination of his clinical experience, which has helped him gain insight into the way we cope and resolve problems. And his website is craigweiner.com, www. So I encourage people to check out this book, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion with you, Dr. Weiner, to hear more about your thoughts on the issues that we've all been spending so much time discussing.
That's true. Yeah, thank you for having me on. And I think that the work you've been doing has been great. So
Thank
I'm very
you.
excited. Yeah, it's
Thank
very
you.
important. Yeah.
So what prompted you to reach out to me with and to have this discussion?
So I was watching some of your podcasts, and what you're trying to discuss is something that's very important to me as well, because the whole field has gone in the direction of activism. And I wrote this Backyard Politics book as a way to address some of the concerns that you've been bringing up with your different recordings.
So going back to when you started to notice this, and started to have some of these concerns yourself, could you just describe what you were observing and what you thought about what was happening?
Yeah, so I was trying to make sense of what everyone's arguing about. And it seems to me when a baby's born, it's totally dependent on other people. There's no expectation of the baby to adapt or uh, show any kind of agency. But over time, we want the child to start to learn to adjust to the world. And to that extent, it's the requirement to meet some kind of expectations or criteria for merit or acceptability, because you want the child to start to function more independently and contribute to the family and contribute to helping others, as well as for us to take care of the child. So there's kind of a balance that eventually has to happen. And when I started to look at what we were fighting about all the time is that one group is claiming that the person is just inundated and helpless and needs to be rescued because external forces are making it impossible for them to flourish. And the other group is saying, no, there's some expectation for the person to adjust to the world and the criteria to meet the standards in the world. But rather than always see the standards as oppressive, there's a requirement for the person to adjust and learn and develop so they can even give to other people or help other people. But who's going to help if everybody's dependent on being rescued? So if you look at the political debate, I start to think that one side is really paying attention to what's happening to the person, how they're being harmed, and the other group is talking about, well, what's the achievement of the person? What can they do to adapt? So if you look at what's happening in psychology, there's a real push towards rescuing, which is everything the curriculums have to change, but there's very little talk about what's the child going to be doing to adjust to the way the school is or where the family is. It's always the parents going to kind of have to make the child happy, these kinds of concerns.
Mm-hmm. And you see this mostly with regard to child psychology and how we treat children.
There's been a shift towards safetyism
Mm-hmm.
as the families got smaller and we learn more about what can harm people.
Mm-hmm.
So in psychology, if you look at your podcasts, you were really talking about they were training the therapists to rescue people and how the trauma and how they're harmed and who's harming who and who should be punished for harming people. And you have to do everything to prevent harm from happening to people. And I think we lost the idea of the person learning to adjust
Mm-hmm.
to what's expected or to perhaps there is a little bit of suffering that goes with adjusting and learning and achieving, but we're kind of going a whole other direction. And I think that's what you were finding in your training when you were
Mm-hmm.
talking about what was going on. What were they training you to do as a therapist?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this activism and this focus on systemic injustice rather than individual resilience.
Yes. And,
Mm-hmm.
and, and I looked at what we're doing in families and I thought it's the same issue, whether it's family or society or
Mm-hmm.
whatever it is, where no, you're harming me so much I can't succeed unless you change. It's your fault. You have to be different. And there's no requirement for me to adjust to you. It's just that you're harming me. So we were looking at other groups that were claiming they're all in a state of harm and there's no requirement for them to do anything to adjust. So
Mm-hmm.
the book I wrote was about taking all these different political arguments, showing it's the same dichotomy each time.
Mm-hmm. How do you make sense of that? Why do you think that the shift has occurred?
Well, I think in many ways the multiple reasons. Families got smaller, so we could protect our kids in different ways. When we were on farms, everybody had to kind of pull their weight.
Mm-hmm.
Life was hard, so you had to endure hardship. It wasn't so easy. We knew less about what can harm. The more you learn
Mm-hmm.
about what can harm, there's a kind of a schools got taken over. Men started to drop out of schools and they're not going to college at the same rate, and schools became more populated with females who are more likely to want to deal with vulnerability
Mm-hmm.
and protection. So there's a push towards protection because there's a push towards equity because if people get ahead you could be vulnerable to the people who are stronger than you. So there's so many factors that go with this.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of power too with protectionism because then somebody has to be the protectors. So
Mm-hmm.
you need centralized power to control everybody so nobody does any harm. So then the government started to be looked at as a rescuing force rather than a force that would stop. It started out that the rights were rights to act, rights to achieve, and people couldn't stop you from your achievements. And then it became shifted to you how it's going to protect you. So now it became rights where I'm supposed to be given certain things because
Mm-hmm.
I'm protected. So there was a whole shift towards protectionism. It could just go with the fact that we became a flourishing place. When life is hard, you're more likely to survive than to want safety and comfort.
Mm-hmm. You brought up a lot of really interesting themes there, like the more female tendency to want fairness and to be risk averse, for one thing, but also kind of the shift to a bureaucratic and like a centralized. And I've wondered how much of these issues are a problem of scale because we have centralized a lot of authority. And so people are less like if you have a small school where there are, let's say, like a really small school, like maybe there's 30 kids or something, all the teachers and everybody who's leading the school knows each kid, knows each family. Everything can be very individualized and they can care for each person in a very specific way and see that their needs are being met and that they're being challenged appropriately. But when you start to get big, like you get these really large schools that have thousands of kids in them, you are treating them like they're all the same. It's kind of like this group level decision making that's happening that loses sight of the individual. And so I've wondered how much of these things are just a product of our greater centralization and the scale at which we're perceiving society, especially as we've all gone online and now we can really, we're connected at a much higher rate to a much larger number of people, but the quality of the connection is lower. So I wonder, what are your thoughts about all of that?
I think that's exactly the case. I think research says that if the group gets too big, you kind of homogenize. You can't adapt to the individual needs of each person. Small communities, we can know each other, we can make small changes to adjust to each other, and then after a while, you lose the possibility of individual adaptation, and you kind of homogenize. So that, and the more you cobble everybody together, like large cities, it's a perfect example. Large cities become the most centralized places with decision making becomes so the individual gets lost in the homogenation.
And so in your career and in your observation of the field of psychology over the time that you've been working, did you see that this was like an inevitable kind of direction that things were pointing and we've just slowly gotten here? Or do you feel like there were points at which thinking and philosophy behind the way we're educating people has really shifted dramatically?
So I think there was a shift. They had kids on milk cartons that they were going to get harmed and like rescue. Everybody started getting more afraid, and then the more you get on the internet, you can know about all these things. And everybody gets afraid, and the more you're afraid, look what happened in COVID. Everybody got afraid, and we succumbed to centralized authority. And they use the fear requires everybody to get in line, like in world wars or anything else. So, but parents start to talk about with getting the kid to be happy,
Mm.
the notion of help your kid be happy rather than what were you trying to do with kids? You're trying to help your kid be successful, achieve, or help your kid do other things besides being happy. Happy is just I lie there, everybody does whatever they want from me. Everybody can be happy, but people have to give it to you. Who's going to get you to be happy?
Mm-hmm.
So that was a shift.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. It's a different perspective completely than wanting your kid to be independent and competent and socially adept, things like this.
Yeah, then that imposes a hardship on the child because you have to do something, you have to struggle. And now we don't have homework because it's hard and they don't want to do it. Or if you don't want to sit in your chair, you can stand. Or if you don't get your subject matter completed in time limits, you get an extra time. Or everybody passes because you don't want to hurt anybody to have them feel badly about themselves.
Mm-hmm.
The whole push about comfort and not, it's almost like everything became a trauma if
Mm-hmm.
it was a hardship. And then the parents could complain to schools and the school had to adjust to complaints. It used to be you didn't have that kind of right to just disrupt standards. So how did that all come about? I think my group in the 60s was doing that a lot where we were rebelling against the Vietnam War and we were uh, not wanting to go to fights, so we were fighting about the status quo, and they start breaking down all the standards. And they had postmodernism for philosophy. Said, well, nothing's really the truth. It's just somebody has power and they're saying what's true. So, well, and then if that's true, I can make my truth. And everybody has their own way of doing things. And so the
Mm-hmm.
notion of authority gets broken down, but then the authority now rose up again, which is the authority of protectionism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. And it seems like it's just a massive cultural attitude change.
Yeah, fathers used to try to get kids to adjust to the outside world, and mothers would be more likely to comfort and help and run inside the family. But then now the whole outside world is kind of a protectionist
Mm-hmm.
view. If you
Mm-hmm.
think about what's going on politically, or even how they were training the therapist when you went to your school, Antioch, what
Mm-hmm.
were they trying to get people to do with the therapy, and who was causing harm? They had to be stopped. They were
Mm-hmm.
causing harm.
Mm-hmm. Do you see any? sensible way to roll some of this back or balance this out so that so that we have a better perspective on human flourishing?
Well, that in the book Backyard Politics, I had a chapter on how do you combine the outside and the inside. So I had the notion of, is the problem on the outside, or is the problem coming from me? Is it coming from some external? And then how do you blend the two? Because there's a certain degree of how do you raise a kid with to protect them, but at the same time help them to be resilient and competent and
Mhm.
adjusting to other people, not just have other people have to adjust to what they want. So that you want to do that with therapy. Think about how therapy has become like an activist activity, like just almost the person complains and you're just kind of feeling badly for them or something, rather than how do you help them? What are they solving? What do they want to do to contribute to the solution?
Mhm.
And so I think it has. I was making the case that in child rearing, if you can get the kids to be, what are they doing on their own? What are they doing to help the family, rather than what's the family doing just to facilitate for them? So that you could do it that way. You have to train teachers the same way. Where if you're always going to change the curriculum and let go of the standards, there's no grades, there's no requirement to do anything. It's always going to make sure everybody's comfortable. Then what happens then? The achievement's been going way down because you're not really holding standards as constant as we used to hold them.
Mhm. Yeah. One of the things that I wonder what you think about this. I've seen this kind of paradox in as schools of education and psychology have been pushing this idea of systemic privilege and marginalization, these kinds of ideas that the system is to blame and it's not the individual. We should, look at ourselves as outgrowths of this greater system. We that have been concerned about this thinking have then mounted a big campaign of criticism against that system. So it's kind of like you're still sort of fighting a system either way. You kind of get looped into that. And I wonder what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I've been thinking the same kind of thing, which is
Mhm.
so now one system gets power, and then we think we're all being harmed by the restrictions and requirements of that. Now if you don't do the new woke stuff, now that's the new oppressor, right? So now that's like the old Republicans who were rigid and requiring everybody to wear short hair or go have certain beliefs. So it's always a notion of who's grabbing power. And then the other people, then you make the case that we need protection from the people now who are harming us. So it just keeps going. So then my view is to how do you keep centralized power from happening? Because then you don't have the notion that everything is coming from some oppressive source. But the book I wrote with identifying what I called the protectors and the promoters, it was see, if you do oppressors and oppressed, then it's pejorative because you got somebody doing some harm. But
Mhm.
if you just look at people who are trying to protect people and people who are just trying to promote people, what's the
Mhm.
pejorative? It's just we're just trying to make it in this world
Mhm.
in terms of that balance. So that's what I was trying to accomplish. I was
Mhm.
getting away from this notion that somebody has to be the evil source.
Mhm.
And I think that happens when you centralize power because you essentially negate the individual's chance to survive as they see they can make their own way in the world. We have to kind of allow people as much possibility for their discretionary authority to to be possible. Otherwise, you're taking away their chance to survive.
Mhm.
And that's why I'm making the case that originally America was built on the idea that you could protect the individual as much as possible to make their way in the world. And then the more government takes over, the more things become centralized. And as you indicated, if it becomes so large, then everybody loses their individuality. It's just
Mhm.
become we all become subjected to the same set of rules and processes that I can't even make a decision. Like in COVID, no one could even make a personal decision. You had to
Mhm.
give your kids a shot, and maybe you didn't think the shot was something to give your kid. You
Mhm.
lost the right to have a store be open, only certain stores. So the government decided what stores could be open.
Mhm. Yeah, it was a dramatic paradigm shift.
Yeah.
Mhm. When you talk about the culture of safetyism and the idea of how that follows from people having more of a perception of threat and smaller families, so a greater need to protect their kids. I I used to really enjoy NPR back in the day. I don't listen to it anymore. I haven't in years, but they did a bunch of like human interest stories, and one of them was this podcast called Hidden Brain, I think. So if people want to look that up, maybe they can find this. I don't, it's been years, but this was a really fascinating segment. They had a guy who studied all of the movements of children in a small town in, I believe it was the 70s. And he went and just studied the children and how much freedom they had. And so it's a small town. And he said, even like the youngest child could go a mile from home, even like the 3-year-olds. They would go with the 7-year-olds and the 9-year-olds. And there was this lake or pond or something that the kids loved to play at. And kids roamed really freely. They rode their bikes for miles. They played really independently. And so he did this tracking of their movements. And then he came back, and I think it was 20 years later, to that same town, and he tracked the movements of kids. And so these were the children of that previous generation, basically. It's like that generation of kids that had all that movement. He came back and watched them, and they had almost no movement. The kids stayed in their homes. They didn't go anywhere without supervision, without an adult around. And it was such a dramatic change in how kids were experiencing life and agency and social development and social opportunity and exploration, and just so much, just such a huge change. And when he was talking about why that could be, one of his thoughts was the way that we broadcast news. This was one of the big changes that had happened, where people now every night could sit and listen to horror stories of kidnappings and murders and horrible things that happen they sit in their living room and they hear this, and it might be about something that happened in Philadelphia, but you live in Texas. So it's not a threat to you, but the fact that it's being piped into your living room increases your threat sensitivity, your awareness of these things. And so we all kind of got hooked on this almost like crime porn in a way, like we're just
Yeah.
pumping in the fear porn, I guess. And it changed how people thought about their kids' freedoms. They thought we need to keep them safe, and they're aware of so many more dangers. And that really stayed with me. It really struck me as a parent myself. I've got two kids they're now grown. They're in their 20s, and then I have two younger kids that are 11 and 13. And I'm aware of myself giving my kids fewer freedoms than I had when I was a kid. And my boys, I let them ride their bikes all over the place. They can go for a couple hours, but I sit and worry about them. I don't think my mom sat around and worried about me. I think she knew I'd be
Yeah.
home at the end of the day. But I
Yeah.
sit and worry if I hear an ambulance go by. I'm like, was that going in the direction of where my kids rode their bikes? And so I feel like some of it's inescapable, even if you're aware of these forces. We're still a part of this zeitgeist or this generation.
Yeah, I agree completely. It used to be, see, now the kid, if the mothers were home, the women formed a neighborhood. So they'd watch each other's kids, and kids would play. And then now the houses are empty and everybody's working. So the kids are going to institutional
Mhm.
after school, or they're always going to uh, like sports, which are always supervised.
Mhm.
So that they don't have a chance. Like, remember Piaget's book, The Moral Development of the Child? They was talking about the kids used to play the marbles, and they would have to work out their rules. And we would do sports. We had to who's safe and how do you decide what the rules are. And
Mhm.
so you're not getting kids to be independent in that sense of learning to negotiate their problems and function without an adult always looking and resolving things. It's
Mhm.
exactly you get the internet, which is the same thing you're kind of saying, that people get aware of all these harms and the things you can just zap somebody off if you don't like what they're saying. So you learn to cancel people very quickly, or you can get safety on the internet because you only talk to people who are your views because and
Mhm.
you don't have the harm of meeting people in person because you can be on the internet. So you have all these different in, problems that have influenced kids, uh,
Mhm.
change the way we operate.
Yeah, you mentioned the internet, and I'm curious, what are your observations and thoughts about how technology, communication technology has contributed to these issues?
So from what I glean from my clients who do this virtual reality and they don't leave their house,
Mhm.
they just have all their relationships online, including their sexual relationships are online.
Mhm.
So what it is they realize over time that they don't get touch. They don't get
Mhm.
physical touch.
Mhm.
And there's something missing for it. But they do it because it's a kind of it feels safer to them in many ways. And
Mhm.
then the other thing is the kids who are on the social platforms and being kind of indoctrinated into certain views. So like if a person says you have interest in boys, that they things that boys like, then well, you must be a boy. So then they get influenced by large groups of people saying the same kinds of things. So it's so
Mhm.
easy to get indoctrinated by the crowd,
Mhm.
which is what you're kind of saying. Where we can kind of see the crowd kind
Mhm.
of is doing this to us.
Yeah, that's it's so interesting. There also seems to be a real immediacy to it. Like with the internet, there's always new information, and we interact with social media, and there's a feed which always puts the newest thing first. And so it feels like things that are older are less relevant, and there's this just real immediacy to the way people are perceiving the world. I wonder, like, we seem to have, let me articulate this. I when I was a kid, I had awareness of things that were from before my time, cultural things like movies or just important things, even sort of unimportant things. Like I was talking to a young client the other day, and I mentioned the phrase "jump the shark," and he didn't know what that meant. And so I was like, I think that comes from Happy Days, but I never watched Happy Days because that was before my time. But I think that that's a reference to a TV show. But he's like, I have no idea what that is, and he'd never heard of this show or this phrase, or And so we got to talking about some other sort of cultural things, and it's just interesting when I talk with young people how little they know of the things of their parents' generation, the music, the just the culture, the popular culture. And there's such a focus on the right now. I don't know if that's how relevant that is or how interesting that is, but one of the things I felt is that people right now are very out of touch with a continuity of human experience.
Yes, yes, yes. So the question is, how does that all come about? Like, if in the old days, if you wanted a toy, you have to save for it, or you'd have to find a way to. Now you can get credit cards, or you could get an advancement from your parent, or you
Mhm.
just get it from your parent, or so you don't have to plan your activities over
Mhm.
longer term. So that's another thing is how do we get to the point where you can just get gratified and in a way, the electronic media gives you immediate gratification. If you're scrolling, you don't like something, you just flick it away. You don't have to
Mhm.
struggle to do anything. And if we're so concerned about not imposing hardship on somebody, then hardship is how you have to really go through hardship to achieve.
Mhm.
Nobody achieves anything long term without incremental steps. And so
Mhm.
that's been lost by credit cards and advancements. And
Yeah, I think that's a really great point about the immediate gratification that we have and just the immediate ability to satisfy our desire to be entertained.
so that's what's going on. So then if you look at what are the people doing when they do this training? They're saying you're harming somebody, but they don't really think about, well, but if you make this adaptation to get rid of this harm, what other things are being caused? If you give everybody a trophy, it looks good in the media. If you give into a tantrum, it looks good too in the media. You get it to stop. But then
Mhm.
what's the secondary and tertiary effects?
Mhm. Mhm.
And that's what's not being looked at is if I lose my benefit, yeah, I lose my benefit, but what happens if I keep my benefit? What happens to me? do I keep achieving, or do you just have my benefit, or what do other people do when they have to give me my benefit? What's the
Mhm.
consequence to them? So
Mhm.
we're not really thinking of problems in its how it in it kind of a deeper way where you're
Mhm.
linking more paired associations together.
Yeah, it's a very short term and tunnel vision sort of view.
That's what seems to be happening. And
Hmm.
is that because we just have a lot of we have the ability to give people whatever they want because we're rich.
Hmm.
It's a trust fund society.
Yeah, yeah, I guess so. I guess so.
The government's a trust fund, or your parents are a trust fund, or somebody's a trust fund.
Yeah.
Right.
What are some useful and constructive ways that people can respond to this in their own lives?
Well, yes, that's what I put in the last chapter of the book is what parenting solution. So I think the notion of parents are very quick to say, "Gee, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have yelled." Okay,
Hmm.
but they don't say, "Well, what could you have done differently?" The kid, the parents are apologetic. All
Hmm.
right, and it could be a reaction to parents being too controlling before, so now they're going the other way. So then now it's you don't want the kid to suffer. But how do you get the kid to be take charge of certain things to help the household run? Rather than if the parent does everything or the parent's guilty because they're not around enough for the child, so now they try to make up for it by making sure the child stays happy because they feel guilty.
Hmm.
But there's so many factors in family life that have changed the way we take care of kids. But the whole thing is to get some blending of protecting and promoting, which was
Hmm.
that's the solution I was recommending. But I think it comes into the therapy training that that you've been addressing, like this notion of what are we training therapists to? What are they being activists about? What's the consequence to the clients to be? Is there any, is there, it's always a notion of, yes, you've been harmed. Let me help you do trauma focused work. But what's the requirement of the person to, what are they solving? Or if I change my body, am I going to solve my problems just because my body's changed? What am I trying to solve? It's like plastic surgery. What are you changing? Like, are you going to really change the things that you're trying to solve? What are you solving when you do these things? So but you're not even allowed to ask these questions because it's now it would be harmful to the person because you're wondering. It's like I think that kids now say, "Well, I don't care. I don't know if the parent wants the kid." So you have to work a kid through all this backlash, which they don't want to. They don't want to. They say, "Well, what do you think you want to do about this?" I don't know. And then the parent says, gives a solution, and you rather than just help the kid learn. Well, what do you think? What if you took a guess? What kind of solution could you have for this so you could remember to do this? What would help you remember, or what could help you take charge of this? It's
Hmm.
working the kid to have some responsibility,
Hmm.
which I
Hmm.
think we're losing track of.
Hmm. And it seems to me that well, your argument is around this stemming from the childhood on, like the way we're raising kids. We're raising kids that are not agentic, independent adults, and then they continue to be sort of coddled, and their victimhood is overrepresented by like the psychology professions and the sort of conversations and dialogues that we've been having culturally. And I think that there's so many aspects of this that seem to be at play. Like there's the over awareness, the hyper awareness of threat that parents might be feeling so that they coddle their kids a little bit more or protect them too much. I like your paradigm, the promoters and the protectors. I think that's really useful because, like you said, it's sort of a destigmatizing paradigm that doesn't focus blame on one. It's more about balance than about eliminating one or the other. But the at the same time as we've seen the more protective parenting strategies coming into play, we've also seen an undermining of family authority. There's so many ways in which parents are expected to share authority, like the state. There's the public health thing. You talked about that with COVID and kids having to get shots that their parents might not think that they need. So this is a medical authority that supersedes the parents' authority. And parents are trained even from pregnancy, really, that they have to see a doctor constantly just to keep their kid safe and alive. So you've got now all these maternity appointments plus a 2-week appointment, a 1-month appointment, a 2-month appointment, a 4-month appointment, 6 months. So they're constantly having to check in with some authority figure. And so the parent is being taught that they don't really have authority over, and they don't really know their own instincts, that they can't trust themselves. They have to trust somebody outside. And then as soon as your child is interfacing with the school system, a lot of parents are really intimidated by the authority of teachers and school administrators. They feel like they can't make a hard statement to their child, a firm statement, because the teacher might undermine that, and then their custody is even risked sometimes. So I kind of wonder, what are your thoughts about the social elements that are contributing to this?
Well, I think that's exactly it. That the more people, the more we defer to the so-called experts, and the experts get together and promote only one view, and then everybody is required to get in line, or you're not allowed to object to it. And that's right. So you get so there's a deference to these elite intelligentsia class, which has been developed in our society, that now take over what to believe and how to operate. And
Mhm.
it shows that more people have gone to college and get millions of degrees, and everybody's an expert. But the problem is you get a takeover of that field in terms of centralized power, which is what's happened. Then that becomes its own systemic source that we're not allowed to divert from. Yeah.
Yeah. The centralization of power, it almost seems inevitable, but do you see a way to uh, take back local power?
Yeah, that's what I'm all for, having less government and well, less centralized decision making,
Mhm.
and then you kind of can you go back to the individual and the chance for individuals to make decisions about their lives. And then, but if you have safetyism, then what I want to do individually becomes, oh, you're harming me. So then
Mhm.
harm becomes supersedes my achievement. My achievement just harms you. So therefore, my words can harm you. Anything I do can harm you. So everybody has to get total safetyism. We all have to be in a bubble, and we can't move. And
Mhm.
somebody has to dictate what the bubble is going to be. And
Mhm.
that's what's happening. So how do you but why would the people who make the bubble want to give up the control of the bubble? They think they're doing good. They're protecting everybody. Yeah, we're
Mhm.
all protected, but we have very, very limited possibilities if we're all protected.
Mhm.
Because achievement takes risks and creativity to do something.
Mhm. With the new presidential administration, we've seen a really rapid rollback of some of the policies that have been contributing to these cultural issues, and some people have expressed concern about the really the mental health of a whole generation of kids that have been taught to believe in certain philosophical ideas. You know, these ideological currents have really swept up an entire generation. And so if they're seeing their paradigm challenged by rapid rollbacks at the executive level, they might be responding to this with a lot of shock, a lot of disbelief, might feel like this is really unfair. And I wonder, what are your observations and thoughts about how that shift might impact people and how to help people integrate?
Yeah, I noticed that some of your podcasts have been about a little bit touching on this stuff about.
Yeah.
So people who are learning to be dependent on the government are
Mhm.
clearly threatened, that they think they're going to be take their sources of uh, living is going to be taken from them. So they're afraid they're going to die or they're going to be
Mhm.
harmed,
Mhm.
and they're not recognizing that other people are also being harmed by the amount that they're being given.
Mhm.
And so again, there's a balance. And if you give, my view is, if you give people help, you want to simultaneously be developing their agency and their chances of learning things so they can help themselves. But you have to kind of be more clearer. You have to be clearer about what kind of help you're giving. Help doesn't mean I just give it to you. It means, well, what are you also doing to benefit from the help in terms of learning something so that you can do more for yourself?
Mhm.
And that's the balance that we've lost. The help is just my gift rather than, like, they use the word privilege.
Mm-hmm.
And I say, well, that's like being a gift. Okay. So some people get gifts, but who's achieving? And then there's a difference. And then just because you had gotten some gifts in life doesn't mean you're not achieving anything. You still might be achieving. So how do you keep people who haven't had many gifts learn to achieve? So you give them enough so they can learn to achieve, but you're not giving them things so they just learn to be dependent on the gift.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we've lost the idea of that blending.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we decide how did that all happen? That just because we had the resources to give people, like kids will say to the parent, "Well, you can afford it,
Mm-hmm.
right?" And they could. So the parent feels guilty. I could give them that. Why don't I give them that?
Mm-hmm. What was it that drew you to the study and practice of psychology in the first place?
Well, my father was a professor of psychology, so I kind of grew up with it,
Mm-hmm.
and so I had a head start. I had the privilege of being exposed to psychology. I had the gift of psychology given to me, so
Mm-hmm.
that's what got me started.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing I learned is not to always follow the crowd in terms of what everybody else was thinking, and I
Mm-hmm.
think that gets me to question thing. So I that's what I did with the ADHD diagnosis. I turned it around to say, well, is there another way to understand these behaviors in terms of what the person's doing rather than they have this deficit, the
Mm-hmm.
delay? Could it be a behavior pattern that gets reinforced when people are avoiding or distracting or imposing or intruding on people or doing all the behaviors? Under what conditions were these behaviors occurring? It wasn't like if it's a neurological thing, why wouldn't it be more consistent? Why is this kid who doesn't have the organization or executive functioning to do their homework or keep a schedule that way? How come they can do intricate battle scenes and put the cannon people here and the people with guns over here, and they do a whole intricate battle? I mean, how would that be if they had that problem? So I
Mm-hmm.
started to just question what are we doing? We have these ideas about most of psychology has gotten the diagnostic system has gotten it so that people have disorders. So we have a population of people who start to think I've got some limitation on me of it's keeping me from flourishing. And so we've got a metaphor of defective, some defect, delay, and that's been a problem in psychology.
Mm-hmm.
That whole shift, because we stopped seeing people as doing behavior rather than having something happening to them. And I think that's created a problem. So it's an outside source again that keeps me from achieving. So we've talked about middle and upper class kids who might be getting a lot in their lives, but lower class kids are also getting the message it's the external world that's making it impossible for me to achieve. So everybody's learning to blame some external source. And that's where I think you get the notion of protectionism, the protectors. Everybody has to have a protector because we all have these things that are making it
Mm-hmm.
impossible for us to flourish, to succeed. And you got to just get rid of these sources of harm, and then I'll be okay. But that doesn't really solve much because then why would I ever give up the harm? I'm always going to find new things that keep me from. That means you have to keep accommodating to me too. When do I respond back?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that sort of touches on something that really alarmed me in my counselor training, which was the focus and the way we focused on diagnosis seemed strange to me, seemed unhealthy. For instance, and I've talked about this a little bit, but not as much as some of the other issues that disturbed me about the counselor training. But when we were assigned clients from within the program so that we could be supervised and have our test our skills and things, we were told by our professors, if you can't find a diagnosis for this person, let me know and I will help you give them a diagnosis like this. And the indication was every single person that you interact with is diagnosable per the DSM. And so you'll hear sometimes statistics in the media, which is like liberal women have a higher number of psychiatric diagnoses or are more likely to have a mental health problem. And what I always think when I read that is, well, if that's a population that's more likely to access psychological treatment or counseling, then they will have diagnoses because every single person who goes to see a counselor comes away with a diagnosis. According to the mental health system, you're all you can find every one of us in that DSM.
It's a great point. If you access the service, you got a diagnosis. And
Hmm.
you say, well, everybody's sicker than ever. Of course, we made them all think that everything that's a problem is because of the diagnosis, we start to think the diagnosis is an explanation for why you're having trouble rather than it's just a label, a descriptive label. If you behave this way, we give you this label.
Hmm.
So if you take ADHD, the way it was formed was they did a statistical analysis and they said if these symptoms, these behavioral problems group together, and if they all group together statistically, then we're going to call them ADHD. So ADHD was a label for people who did these sets of behaviors. It doesn't say why they do it, but then it became instead of you're doing ADHD and we give you this label, now you have ADHD. This is the label now is the cause of why you behave. So,
Hmm.
and it's a beautiful example of systemic problem. Now
Hmm.
that becomes a systemic problem.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. It's really interesting how to look back at how the field of psychology has contributed to where we are over time. There've been some really wonderful contributions, but there's also been some ways it's led us down a path that's led to where we are.
Very much so. The medicalization of psychology is incredible. When if you notice that the training isn't even really like it used to be about. I mean, we'd go over tapes and just each interaction and what the response was and what this response could have meant. And so you're not dealing with getting a list of symptoms somehow. And somehow you're getting to the real meat of the matter by the label you can come up with. That's what this supervisor was telling you. Well, I'll give you the label, and then you solved it. And
Hmm.
it's a heterogeneous group of people within that label, so they're not all the same. It's,
Hmm.
you mentioned this in one of your podcasts. The intergroup variation was extensive compared to the intragroup variation and the intergroup variation. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it's really it's the medicalization of psychology and the medicalization of society has been um, just something to behold.
So I think that's part of what's going on. And if we're all suffering, then we really need somebody to take care of us, and that's the
Mhm.
government.
Mhm. Yeah,
They'll they'll take care of us.
yeah, yeah, and all the way to assisted suicide.
That's right. There you go. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. So, in summary, what will
Yeah.
people find when they purchase your book? What's sort of the arc of the work that you've presented in this particular piece?
Okay. So I discuss in detail what I mean by a protector ideology and a promoter ideology, and we kind of went over that a little bit, and then I talked about applying the arguments for poverty and racism. What's this racism thing? Freedom of speech, and then the patriarchy.
Mhm.
Like to see men relationship between men and women. Is it a Marxist relationship where men are the oppressors and being, or is it kind of people struggling to live in the world the best they can? And so it's a protector promoter metaphor is different than an oppressive repressive metaphor. So then I talked about how all these protector and promoter categories act out in child rearing and family life. And then my resolution was some of the things we discussed, which is how do you kind of combine the two? So I know that you get this the whole idea of racism and is the notion that there's always a harming group and a victim group. And with poverty, capitalist, there's the property owners who are oppressors and the victims who don't have problems. So that I'm trying to show how that plays out. That how do you help people who don't have money? How would they best get money? Is it just to give them money, or is it to help them earn money or learn to have money, or what systems are in place that are preventing people from having money, or what does it mean, quality of opportunity? I look at all these concepts, freedom of speech, like nothing is ever going to be equal opportunity, because if I come to a certain situation with more skills than somebody else, it's never going to be equal achievement. And even if you make everything equal, we're not equal transducers. So I may learn differently than somebody else, may learn more slowly, more quickly. And then if you keep making everybody even, you're keeping people from achieving, basically, because you have to always attenuate people's achievements to make sure they don't get ahead. So because no one could be behind. So if you notice, there's this kind of pejorative, billionaires. If it's a billionaire on the right, it's a pejorative. If it's somebody on the left, billionaire, you don't get that. But it's whoever you deem is oppressing, is a harmful. It's always who's the harm? Where's the source of harm? Is it external, or is it also your behavior and how you could be different, and then there'll be less harm too? It's not just I'm harming. So but that's what you want to keep in child rearing. And even in politics, if you look at each argument, it's always there's some evil group somehow that's doing something to somebody, rather than well, what's the other people doing themselves? And how could they be different? That's the kind of thing I think we've lost maybe in therapy and in society.
It seems to me that teaching people that they're powerless is a terrible thing because, transmitting a sense of hopelessness and powerlessness is a great harm to the individual. That's a terrible feeling. So teaching people to find their agency and find what they can do about something is much healthier for children, for raising kids, for promoting well-being.
Yes, and with our clients as well. But
Mhm.
if you don't, the problem is if if I want power, then I get more power if you're powerless. Because
Mhm.
and if you're totally dependent on me, I'm gonna have all the discretionary authority. So I almost, if the government said, if I have a benefit for you to be powerless,
Mhm.
because then the power can shift to me.
Mhm.
And then my idea of the world, my tableau of what I think the world should be like, gets given to me. And the more you have the government think that they're entitled to run everybody's lives,
Mhm.
then scaring people and having harm exaggerated will scare people into letting somebody else take care of them.
Mhm.
So there's a whole cycle here we're in, and and people who are trained as therapists want to help people, and they believe that if they block what's harming these people, they'll help your client. I think that you kind of is that the experience you had when you were getting trained, that there was this kind of view that these people were being harmed, and we had to fight back against what we thought was harming them, rather than. And if women think that male female relationships are patriarchy,
Mhm.
are harm group, that's 51% of the population,
Mhm.
and they raise the kids. So that there's a whole, if people start to adapt this oppressor oppressed metaphor, we're going to end up this way.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, I think your framework is really insightful, and the way that you've laid it out is very helpful. I really appreciate you talking to me about this book and these ideas. And is there anything you want to say in closing, or anything that we didn't really touch on?
And we didn't, nothing comes to mind, but I just thank you for having me join in. So,
Yeah,
yes.
it's been my pleasure and a delight to speak with you, Dr. Weiner. Thank you so much.
Okay, take care.
You too.